Hello everyone, I'm Peter Sellen. In this segment we'll be talking about a very important topic. It's the funding of the justice system in Australia, how it all works. We'll find out from some experts. Firstly, my guest, one of my guests tonight, David Edwardson, who's a QC and a barrister. Welcome to you, David.
Thank you.
Cheryl Axleby, who's the CEO of the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement.
Thank you.
Welcome to you. And Morry Bailes, who happens to be the President of South Australia's Law Society. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you.
Good to have you all here, and hopefully we can shed some light on how this system works, because a lot of people wouldn't know. It's a very murky and mysterious area. Funding for this whole system, first to you, Morry, is that an issue? Do we have enough money? How do we keep this thing rolling along?
It's very much an issue. We don't have enough money. It's not probably a matter of sticking a hand out and just asking for more and more. There's a limit to what governments can give us. So we need to start thinking innovatively about how to fund justice. When I make comparisons with, for example, the medical sector, doctors are expensive, hospitals are expensive, but we have medical insurance, and the legal industry might want to take a leaf out of medicine and start looking at alternate methods of funding, for example, legal insurance.
So if we don't have that, is there a risk that the system might collapse at some point in the future?
I think that seize up is probably a good way of putting it, and there's an increasing number of unrepresented people who can't afford the justice system, and that's not a good thing within society.
Cheryl, from your perspective and the people you deal with, how does this work? How do you feel about this funding issue?
Well, it's been prevalent for Aboriginal legal services for many years anyway, and it is getting worse. And I think in the context of governments wanting to make savings and cost-saving measures, particularly in our justice system, we're starting to see it unfold, particularly like with overcrowding in prisons, also in police stations, like when people are taken into custody on remand. I think we need to be a bit more innovative, and hence why I've always been an advocate for early intervention and justice reinvestment and looking at different strategies instead of prison.
I say a lot of Aboriginal people are overrepresented in prison populations as well. Are you concerned about that? Obviously you would be.
Oh, very alarming, and particularly because it's ever increasing. At the moment it's around about 26 more times likely for an Aboriginal person to be incarcerated in comparison to the rest of Australia. And I think also when we look at the getting tough on crime within politics, we're starting to see the outcome of that you might want to please a community when you're wanting to come towards an election, but you also have to be prepared for the outfall that comes with that.
So, David, from a criminal barrister's point of view, I guess the dregs of society is a term that a lot of people say going through the court system. How do you find it from your perspective in a criminal sense?
The criminal justice system has been grossly under-resourced really for the last 10 years. Prisons are completely maxed out. We've reached capacity. If you want to have a rack 'em, pack 'em and stack 'em mentality, you've got to be able to resource it. And in short, we haven't been doing it for a very long time. We've got multiple judges down in the District Court, Supreme Court, and in fact the Youth Court. Legal aid is under-resourced, underpaid, and the prisons themselves, as I've already said, have already reached capacity. So we are, in my view, at breaking point.
So what's the solution? Is there a way of streamlining the system? Obviously magistrates are fairly overworked. I mean, I've done some court stories in my time on the TV and radio. There's always a flood of people, and they're always adjourning to another date. It's a very complicated system. Is there any way of making it any easier?
Oh, I think there's always room for considerable improvement procedurally. Indeed, everyone has been working quite hard at that over quite some time. But once you get to the District and Supreme Court, which is where the major indictable, more serious offences are tried, undoubtedly you need to have a court that functions. You need to have enough judges to be able to process these people, and if they are to go to jail, then ultimately they've got to be properly housed. Another factor that has caused a lot of problems is that people are what we call prescribed applicants. In other words, there's a presumption against bail. So immediately you've got an increase of people on remand. So the only way in which you can resolve that is basically building more prisons or having more judges.
So, Morry, what about the physical demands of a judge and a magistrate? Obviously, they're not there forever. When they leave, are they easily replaced, or is this an issue as well as far as the cost of the system?
The appointment of a judicial officer comes with certain costs, and so a cynic might look at the fact that we are down judges, as David's just said, and question why, and why government won't invest in that way. But look, it's accepted that a judge or magistrate will cost a certain amount of money, and it's a requirement in society that government fund properly a justice system to allow people to access justice. That's just one of the fundamental basic tenets of being in a society such as ours. Of course, it costs money, but that shouldn't stop the appointment of the requisite or adequate number of judges and magistrates to deal with it.
We've often heard, the judges' salaries often make the news, and is that justified, do you think, in your view?
A lot of judges will take a lot less than what they might make as QCs in the private profession. So there's a certain sacrifice associated with being a judge. Also, just to put a myth to bed, it is difficult. It is difficult to be a judge. Judges are the people who send people to jail. Let's not forget that that's a difficult task. You've got to be able to go home and sleep at night. So I don't envy their positions. It's a tough job.
Cheryl, from your perspective, a lot of people who get into trouble with the law, it might only be a minor offence, they feel that they have no redress, they're too scared to get into the court system. Are you finding that you're getting a lot of people that's all too hard and I just don't want to do it, don't want to know about it?
Well, I think some of the challenges for people that are going through the justice system is, there's a lot of, I suppose, legislative changes that's actually happening. And I suppose one that's hard for people to keep up with, and particularly, the general person in society who's got to go through the court system herself. And also I think, the government are trying to be a little bit creative in regards to creating legislation, but end of the day, if, a person feels that they want to go through the justice system to prove their innocence, where there's a lot more pressure these days in regards to, plea bargaining and pleading guilty and you get a better deal construct. Well, not everybody in society wants to go and do that.
No. So, David, prison overcrowding obviously is a big issue. I mean, you can build more prisons. It's like the boat people say, you build places to put them, and if there's no one to put in there, then that's fine. The system seems to work a little better that way. Is there any solution to that? Is building more prisons the way to go, or do we need to filter the system before they get there?
The starting point, I think, is that you've got to be able to house those persons who are being sent to prison, and we simply don't have the capacity to do that in South Australia. They're actually moving, alarmingly, they're moving prisoners from holding cells, which are designed for overnight arrest, not for people who are actually on remand, from one police station to the next, because there's just nowhere that they can house them, and that's, from my point of view, very disturbing indeed. The other thing is getting access to prisoners as well. That's a huge problem for the legal profession because they're being moved continually. The resources and capacity to actually allow the legal practitioner to consult with the prisoner is very limited indeed, which means that can potentially compromise their capacity to defend themselves and instruct those that represent them. So that's another issue which is very significant indeed. There are virtually no rehabilitation programs in South Australia. So again, you've got this problem of, I think Cheryl's point was a good one, a lack of early intervention, a lack of rehabilitation, and a lack of trying to educate people who might otherwise be better off outside of prison rather than being educated in prison the wrong way.
Okay. Thanks, David. We'll be back with more of this segment, talking about funding for the justice system and all that entails in just a moment. And now we continue our discussion with our panel of experts on the funding of the justice system in Australia. Morry Bailes, President of the Law Society of South Australia. We're talking civil and criminal issues. Now, they're two separate things, but one is colliding with the other. Yeah,
there's an interplay between the criminal justice system and the civil justice system, and it's particularly evident in our district court in South Australia. There's an estimated probably 80% of the court list, which is now criminal. That's gone up from about 50%. The reasons are, as David described earlier, a tough on crime sort of agenda and changes to law, which has meant more people are being tried for criminal acts. Now that has a knock-on effect in terms of a judge's ability to hear a civil matter, and our civil trial lists are also blowing out, to use an expression. This is not good. There's an old adage in law which is quick justice is good justice. So the longer that civil litigants, particularly say a defendant, can hold out on paying what might be due to a plaintiff, the more the system gets abused.
Cheryl, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, similarly, and I suppose from my perspective, from an Aboriginal Legal Service perspective, family law, child protection are two key areas that, I suppose, in the context, again, we're looking at statistics, we're having about 30% of Aboriginal children going into care, and it's alarming in the context of that parents aren't able to, I suppose, adequately challenge those decisions.
I was going to say, because a lot of people are afraid to get into the system because, as we say, there are lots of difficulties and lots of pitfalls for them.
Yes, the access, particularly to the civil jurisdiction, as Morry's already said, is becoming more difficult.
So, David, the people on remand, they're meant to be there for a short while and then move on and hopefully have their case heard. Is that not happening in any efficient way these days?
No, it's not. One of the most frustrating aspects of the criminal justice system as it exists here in this state as we speak is that it's not uncommon for trials not to be reached, not once, not twice, but sometimes 3 times. Now, I don't know what the hidden cost of all of that is, but it must be enormous. And that has not only a cost to the litigant if they happen to be funding it themselves, lost costs if it's legal aid, but all the witnesses, for example, that are getting ready to go to trial, victims who suddenly find that the trial's not being reached. I don't know what that does to them psychologically, but I imagine it would be very difficult indeed. So all round, it's extremely unsatisfactory.
So obviously, lawyers and people involved in the system have some idea of how to improve it. Do you think you'll ever be heard? Do you think the voice of reason might prevail in certain areas, or is it just not possible? What do you think, Dave?
For my part, I think ultimately, if the government has the capacity to properly fund and remodel the existing procedures, it can work. But that will come at a cost, and certainly at the moment, economically, it doesn't look as though there's enough money to effectively fund what needs to be done, and therein lies the problem.
Well, Morry, you said earlier that we have Medicare and all these medical for other professions. Do you think the government would be responsive or receptive to some kind of push from the legal profession en masse to get that done? Is that possible? I don't know.
It's possible. If we look at Europe, there are examples where a majority of the population are legally insured. Germany is an example. The Productivity Commission federally is currently conducting an inquiry into the cost and access of civil justice, and it's that type of inquiry that might hold those sorts of recommendations. So where there's a will, there's a way. I'm with David. I think this is an area which is underfunded, but if governments and lawyers have a determination to make it work, we can make it work.
Now, there's the legal aid. Obviously, people don't have the money, the wherewithal to do anything in the court system. Is legal aid still a functioning thing for you guys? Is it still something an option for many people?
Yeah, well, I can't speak on behalf of Legal Services Commission, but from Aboriginal legal rights perspective, meeting the demand without getting, if you're going to get tough on crime, then you've got to actually up the resources. That's my view in that context. And we get 4.9 million a year, and Legal Services Commission I think get around about 35 million a year, and yet statistics from 2010 to 2011, I think, ALRM had around about half of the amount of clients that Legal Services Commission did. So in that context, when you talk about access to justice and equity, particularly from an Aboriginal perspective, I think, and particularly when we're 26 more times to be, likely in the system, there's got to be something done there, in that context.
So, David, if the money isn't forthcoming or isn't indexed to keep pace with what is needed to be done, what's the future for the legal system as far as funding is concerned? Is it looking bleak, or do we need to do something drastic?
You took the word right out of my mouth. Very bleak.
Or state-wise? Or
very bleak indeed. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all very well, as I said earlier, and I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself, but there are people who really shouldn't be in prison, who are. And I think looking at alternative means by which people can be punished for what they've done, contribute to the community, ensure that the community is protected short of prison, then that's a much better alternative.
So the criteria needs to be changed, the strength of the sentence or the crime or whatever needs to be modified so that these people don't actually wind up in the system.
That's right. And you can't generalise.
So what percentage overall of people, I mean, I've been in court for doing stories and what have you, and what percentage of the Australian population actually does go to court for whatever offence, Morry, perhaps you know? I don't know.
I can't cite a statistic off the top of my head, but obviously the minority. Just picking up on what David says, I think it should exercise our minds, because if we look at it, there's a story here for everyone. For those concerned about civil liberties and so forth, you'd be worried about the humane conditions that prisoners live in. For the economic dries, it costs money to put these people in prison. The longer that it takes to get a matter to court, the more it costs. And in terms of a victim's point of view, the longer it takes to get to a conclusion of the matter, the worse you are. So it's something that should concern all aspects of society, and we need to do something about it.
I'd like to thank our guests for coming in, David Edwardson, QC, Cheryl Axleby from the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, and Morry Bailes from the Law